Morning. Did I successfully turn that on? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kutarna. I am a fellow at Oxford University at a research center there called the Oxford Martin School. And this is my first time in Brazil, let alone Sao Paulo. So it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the organizers for making it possible for me to be a part of your 2 weeks here at the University of Sao Paulo. You can probably hear I'm just getting over a cold, so I apologize for that. That's why I'm keeping my distance. But I had a really good night's sleep last night, so I'm going to give you all the energy that I have. Maybe just briefly a bit more about me. The Oxford Martin School is a really neat place at Oxford University. Oxford University has the distinction of being one of the oldest universities in the world, which is great. It means that there are a lot of nice buildings. It's also really inconvenient. If you live at Oxford, you sort of live in 19th century accommodations, which aren't that convenient and get very cold in the winter. The other downside to being an old university is that the academic culture has some very old habits and some old ways of thinking. So the university as a whole is divided into 4 big academic disciplines. There's sort of sciences, social sciences, the humanities, and medicine. And these 4 worlds at Oxford, they don't talk to one another because they've lived in their own world for centuries. And that's a problem because a lot of the challenges that we face in the world today, like climate change, you just can't solve them from within one discipline. Right? And so the Oxford Martin School, where I'm based, it's about trying to break that problem at Oxford University to identify what we think are some of the big challenges that humanity faces in the 21st century, like climate change, and then to bring together research from all these different worlds to try to attack them. So I've been there for a couple of years now, and my mind is starting to explode, which is exciting. What I want to do this morning, so we've been at this for 2 weeks now, right? Wow. You guys are hardcore. 2 weeks of that. You must have gone on such a journey over these 2 weeks. And there are people from 30 countries here, right, or so. Any Canadians in the room? Well, there's me. But any other? Okay, just curious. And going really deep into the science, the implications, the adaptation, the politics of climate change. Right? What I want to do on sort of this second last day is to help you all take a big step back and talk about everything else. All right? The context, the wider context in which we have to deal with climate change, right? Because one of the biggest challenges with climate change is that it's not the only challenge that we face, right? And so getting communities, getting businesses, getting governments to make these choices a priority, right? To make, fulfilling our agreements, our commitments under the Paris Agreement a priority when there are all these other challenges competing for our votes, competing for our resources, competing for our time? That's what makes this really difficult. Right? So what I hope to do this morning is just, give ourselves the luxury of just stepping back from this one issue and putting it in this bigger context. And hopefully just share a lot of interesting stuff about what's going on in many other dimensions of how the world is changing right now. Does that sound good? Okay. And I think the format is going to be, I'm going to talk for about an hour and a half or until my voice gives out. I think we'll have a little break, and then we're going to do some Q&A. Weber's going to grill me for the rest of the morning. I wanted to start with a very important word, I think. Ooh, okay, excellent. Perspective. Right? Because, the problems, when we look at a problem, what we see depends on where we look at it from, how we look at it. Just out of curiosity, when you see this, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Anyone? Home. We are nothing. Oh, got to think about that one. Yeah. That's a little deep for a Friday morning. Yeah. But hold on to that. Anything else? Home, nothingness. It's the earth. Wow, somebody's got sharp eyes. Did anyone's first impression be sunset? Because this is also sunset, right? I tried to find South America. It seems that for whatever reason, most satellite photography on the internet tends to show North America. I don't know what's going on there. This is probably, sunset in, say, New York City. It's very interesting, this thing called sunset. If we're standing here in Sao Paulo, or we're standing in New York City at sunset, it looks like the sun is setting, right, under the western horizon. But of course, once we take a step back, we immediately see that, of course, that's not what's really going on, right? The reality is that the earth is spinning. Just out of curiosity, since I know no Portuguese, what's Portuguese for sunset? Okay. Pôr do sol. So I have not yet found the language that recognizes the reality. In every language, we still talk about sunrise and sunset. Even though it's been 500 years now since a Polish astronomer, his name is Nicholas Copernicus. Any Polish people in the room? Okay. Anyway, just curious. Since a Polish astronomer said to his colleagues, look, guys, we talk about sunrise and sunset, but I think that is just a mistake of our perspective. I think what's really going on here is that the sun is fixed, and it just appears to be moving in the sky because the earth is spinning on its own axis. Right? Now that's 500 years, and that insight still hasn't penetrated our language, in any language that I've encountered. And it's a powerful lesson in how our perspective, where we're standing from to look at an issue, warps and shapes how we understand it. Does that make sense? So, interesting, a little bit more on Copernicus. This is the picture of the universe. This is the perspective that Copernicus grew up with before he had his idea. So you got the Earth at the center of the universe, and all the planets in the sky and the sun orbiting around the Earth. And it looks very complicated, doesn't it? All these other orbits. There's a reason for that. Because with the Earth at the center, how else would you explain that, say, Venus, for example, appears to get brighter and then dimmer and then brighter again throughout the year? It must have this kind of looping orbit. All the planets must have this kind of looping orbit. But then once you flip the Earth and the Sun in that picture, all this complexity sort of falls away. And you're left with these circles, right, to describe the movement of the heavens. Very interestingly, one of the reasons that Copernicus was so confident that he was right was that he was a deeply religious man. And he believed that the universe, the creation, must reflect the mind of God. Right? And he said, surely now we see the mind of God more clearly. Right? Now, and I think, just as an aside, I think that's going to be true in this 21st century for a lot of things, a lot of topics, whether it's climate change, whether it's artificial intelligence. We feel overwhelmed by the complexity of the stuff we're looking at. And part of resolving that complexity is going to be reaching a new level of understanding where it all kind of falls away and we start to see some simpler governing forces at work. Now, just as an aside, I'm coming back to the comment here in the front. Now, today we all know that Copernicus was wrong too, right? The sun is no more the center of the universe than the Earth is. Right? And since the 1920s, since his name is Edwin Hubble, the Hubble telescope was named after him, we've known that the sun itself is moving through space. Right? The stars are moving apart from one another. The universe is expanding. Right? So that we've known for almost 100 years now. Right? So I'm sure, and I'm going to see if this little video is going to work. But if it does, the point I want to make is, after 100 years, no one should be surprised by this. That this is actually a better picture of our reality as we've understood it for already 100 years. Right? That the sun is a ball of gas that's hurtling through space, and that the Earth and the other planets are caught in its gravity well. Right? No one was surprised by this, right? This is the picture that we have in our minds when we think about the human condition, right? It's kind of trippy, I think. I'll see if I can get it. All right. So my point is that perspective is a powerful thing. Right? And the challenge for us, then, is to find the right perspective, right? The helpful perspective. Right? Something that is not so close to events that we can't make sense of them, not so far away that nothing seems to matter. To find that perspective. In my perspective, the hallucination that I've been living in for the last year or so is that this moment we're in, 2017, the beginning of the 21st century, is a second Renaissance. It's another age of discovery. And, standing here in Sao Paulo, I don't have to tell you that by that I don't mean, some golden age of sort of universal beauty and truth. Right? That's not what the historical Renaissance was. Is this going back again? Sorry. I didn't do it. I didn't do it. Okay, something is happening. Is that gonna? Let's see if it's gonna. Because the HDMI cable. So how else would we do it? Well, let's just work with it. It might be okay. Let's see if it's okay. Because that's not a big deal. I don't mind editing it from time to time. It's fine. So my lens, my perspective, I'm trying to use some history to make sense of a lot of things happening in the world today. And I think that we're living in a Renaissance moment. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think that there are a few qualities to a Renaissance moment. And the first is new maps, right? So the European Renaissance, I look at as a period roughly from 1450 to 1550, okay, that century. And in 1450, this was the best map of the world that European civilization had access to. Right? This is from Ptolemy, the Greek polymath, and his geography, which was published in the 2nd century AD. This is the Indian Ocean, okay, which Europe thought was landlocked. Okay, this is Africa. It had no southern tip. And then obviously the Americas just completely did not exist in European consciousness in the 1450s. But within just 50 years, okay, that is going to happen a lot, isn't it? Okay. Temporary pause while we sort out the IT issue. Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay, let's try that. Okay. But then we had these things which Europe called the voyages of discovery by Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, which within about 50 years made this map possible. And these flows, right? Slaves began to be transported from Africa to the Americas, American sugar and tobacco to Europe, American silver to Asia, so that Asian spices and silks could be shipped back to Europe. Right? It was the first time that the world's precious resources, as they were understood 500 years ago, were put into truly global motion. And it was actually the first globalization. The second characteristic, obviously, of the European Renaissance 500 years ago was new media. So Johannes Gutenberg in the 1450s, he invents, well, the Chinese would dispute that. He didn't invent the printing press so much as he reinvented it. The Chinese had developed it about 500 years before that. But develops the printing press in Europe. And one of the key characteristics of the advent of print in Europe was how quickly this new medium spread. Right? So the first printing press appeared in Mainz in the 1450s, and by 1500, printing presses dotted all of Europe. Somewhere between 20 and 100 million books were printed in those first 50 years. So that you had parents who had grown up having never seen a book, who had children for whom they were an ordinary part of their daily lives. It was that fast. In those 50 years, Europe collected 2,000 years of Western knowledge and then doubled it. And the next 25 years, doubled it again. So that knowledge creation in Western civilization went from gradual to exponential, if that sounds familiar. And what were the consequences of this moment of all these new global flows, these new maps, and this new media? Well, one of them, and maybe the consequence that we remember best today when we think of the Renaissance, is that there was a genuine flourishing of genius. This was a century when Copernicus, but also Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Thomas More, Martin Luther, Machiavelli, right? They coexisted and they co-created not just incremental changes, but paradigm shifts in science, art, moral philosophy. Contemporary historians look back at that century and see it as a shift in Western civilization from the medieval to the early modern era. Right? But there was a whole other side to that moment, which was a flourishing of risk. Right? So, Columbus discovers the Americas, say discovers, because obviously it had been discovered several thousand years prior. But he connects America and Europe. And new pandemics flow in both directions across the now connected Atlantic Ocean. Right? Economic shocks. This is Venice in the 1490s, the richest place on earth per capita because of its command of the spice trade, until the Portuguese discovered, there's a sea route to these same spices. And as the spice trade shifted to the ocean, communities all along the old Silk Roads fell into decline. If you were a spice merchant in Venice in the 1490s, the year after Portugal discovered this sea route, the price of your product fell by 50% in Venice because people expected a better price on the Atlantic coast. Right? And something that a lot of economies, businesses can relate to today is that it's not that the Venetian merchants had done anything different or wrong. It was just that the whole economic center of gravity was shifting from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Is Siri in the room? This century was also a time of political shock. Right? So 500 years ago this year, a monk named Martin Luther nails his 99 Theses against Indulgences to a church door in Wittenberg. Right? And he strikes a nerve, right? A popular chord with a population in Europe that was getting frustrated with this faraway bureaucracy that nonetheless seemed to control every aspect of their daily lives. Right? That claimed to serve the people, but often seemed only to serve the elite and their own hierarchy. I mean, selling indulgences, right? Buying your way into heaven. What could be more corrupt than that? Right? And the target of his dissatisfaction, the Catholic Church, was complacent. Thought, this is no big deal. People have stood up and complained about our practices before. What they didn't expect is that his thesis would be taken down, would be printed and distributed farther and faster than even Martin Luther thought was possible, and sparked a revolution, a protest reformation, a Protestant reformation that ultimately broke Europe into Catholic and Protestant halves, started a century of religious war, and a century of refugee crises as the European population sort of moved around to reshuffle itself into Protestants and into Catholics. Elsewhere in Europe, in this same time period, you had populist politicians seize power from elites. So in Florence was the heart of Renaissance Europe. This man, Savonarola, he stepped into the city, saw a city that was deeply upset with how quickly their traditional world was changing. And he pointed at the leadership, who were the Medici, and said it's their fault. These people who have been in power for so long, who have never had anyone contest their power, they're too weak and corrupt to guide you through this time that we're living in. Right? But follow me, and I will make you richer, greater, more powerful than this city has ever been. He ignited a popular revolution. We remember it today as the bonfire of the vanities. Right? To reject the new objects, the new thinking that was challenging people's traditional values, to eject the Medici from their control over Florence, and to establish himself as the de facto king. So my point is that we've seen, populist loudmouths take over our communities before. And so I kind of feel like that's the moment that we're into. Right? Going back to my first word of perspective, I think thinking of this present as a Renaissance moment, as a time of new maps and new media that is producing a flourishing of genius, but also a flourishing of risk, is a helpful way to take a lot of the complexity that is challenging our understanding of the present and to simplify it into a lens that just helps to make more sense. So what I want to do for the rest of my talking time is just look at some of the broader things that are changing, that are happening in the world today through that Renaissance lens. And just very quickly try to organize for us the broader context in which we need to marshal public support for dealing with climate change, right? Marshal political support, and also move forward these agendas. So, if this is a second Renaissance, what are our new maps? What are the new maps that we are contesting with? And I think there are a lot of answers to that question. Probably, I'm a political scientist and economist, so the biggest new map that I think of is this radical shift in economic geography that has taken place over the last 30 years. Right? So this is a very interesting, sorry, it's not a great graphic, but very interesting study about the economic center of gravity in the world throughout history. And the way that you do this analysis is you take the GDP of a country and you geocode it to that country's capital. Right? And then you determine the global average location of GDP. And for much of the last 2 millennia, that center of gravity has been somewhere in Afghanistan. And then, which is just to say, from this point, equal economic activity to the east and west and north and south of that point. And then around 1820, something really remarkable happened to sort of the location of economic activity in the world. Anybody want to tell me what that is? In the 1820s? The Industrial Revolution. Exactly right. And so as Europe develops a new technology to make a lot more stuff per person, the economic center of gravity shoots westward. 1913, 1940, 2 world wars in Europe, right, destroy the capital stock in Europe, the economic productivity of Europe, and help to lift it in the Americas so that the economic center of gravity begins to shift even farther west. And in history, 1950 is the most Western, if you will, to borrow some crude language, that economic activity has been in recorded history. And then since then, that center of gravity has been pulling back eastward, right? With the recovery of Europe, the Marshall Plan, the recovery of Japan. 2000 was when China joined the WTO. And you could see, as China entered into a traded economic order, an export-driven economy, and just a lift in productivity in China, how heavily that has pulled economic center of gravity back until sort of by today, over the next 10 years, we're going to return to a kind of long-term global average in terms of the balance between east and west of economic activity. Which means, and this is sort of as political economists, political scientists, which I am, this is a fundamental reality that I'm going to navigate my whole life. My children are going to navigate. That, for example, by 2030, 2/3 of the middle class population globally is going to be in Asia. And why do we care about the middle class? Well, as economists, it's once we reach middle class consumption levels that we have the disposable income, to buy all the interesting goods and services that an economy makes, right? Suddenly you're open to the market, right? And so much of our economic activity is really geared towards finding the middle class and selling into the middle class. By 2050, 2/3 of all middle class spending is going to be in Asia. Right? And that's a big part of the economic geography of the world that's changing very quickly in our lifetimes. What about our new maps? Our new media. Well, obviously, it's digitization. Right? It's the internet. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say I'm old enough to remember a time when we had separate devices for phone calls and listening to music and watching video, reading the news, and of course now all of that has disappeared because each of those types of content has been rendered into a uniform media. A uniform medium, which is zeros and ones. Right? Why has that happened in our lifetime? The big explanation, the simplest explanation is Moore's Law, right? Which I'm sure many of us have heard of. Yes? Did you have a question?
No. I just want to ask if someone knows what Moore's Law is.
Okay, the briefest way to explain Moore's Law is that computing power doubles every 18 to 24 months or so, which is really saying that we're making the transistors smaller and smaller and smaller so we can put more in the same space. But unless you want, there are people in this room who know much more about the engineering of integrated circuits than I do, so I'm not going to try to explain it. But this inflation in computing power has had a couple of implications. One I'll talk about later when we talk a bit about science. But the one that we're most familiar with in our daily lives is that it has made it possible to shrink the digital interface. And I don't have my, where's my phone? I'm naked without my phone. All right, so here's my phone. So now the digital interface, is at my fingertips. That everything I touch and everything that I see, right, everything that I say can take on digital properties. Which means it can be copied an infinite number of times. It can be sent anywhere instantaneously. And that's new, that I can carry this digital interface with me. Again, I'm dating myself, but Weber and I remember, 20 years ago. This is my first time real. Like in São Paulo, I can take a picture here. Hi, everyone. Okay, smile. Okay. And I'm literally going to do this right now. Hi, Mom. Back in the Americas. Okay. Excellent. She'll love that. She'll love that. I just sent my mom that picture. Right? So 25, you guys weren't here, but 25 years ago, how did I do that? Right? When I took my film in to be developed, I ordered a second set of prints, and I mailed the second set to my mom. Right? That was like a 2-week process, and now it's 2 seconds. Right? So this we all know, and it means that we all now suddenly live in this digital medium. Right? And there are all sorts of sociological consequences. We talk about social media, fake news, all of this. Just looking at the raw data that we produce. In 2001, we produced about an exabyte per year, all of humanity all together. In 2013, it was an exabyte per day. Now it's about an exabyte every 5 hours. So an exabyte is a meaningless number, but this is a 128 gigabyte iPhone. I would need a stack 30 kilometers high, an exabyte of data every 5 hours. Do we care? What does that mean? First of all, it's true that 60% of all that data is all of us watching, I don't know, the last season of whatever on Netflix. I just finished House of Cards. I don't know what that was like a month ago. I don't know what people are watching right now. So a lot of it is copies. But even stripping away the copies, we're producing in a year more unique information than sort of the entire history of the spoken language, of writing, of print produced up to the year 2000. Okay. And why do we care about that? Well, because, I don't have a picture of it. Darn it. Oh well. I'll just explain it. Because economists have something called a Preston curve. Anyone heard of the Preston curve? What a Preston curve is, very simple analysis. You take every country of the world and you plot it by GDP per capita on the horizontal, so income, and life expectancy on the vertical. Okay. And if you do that for every country in the world, you get this sort of sloping curve, this asymptote, we say. You get very high increases in life expectancy at low levels of income, and then more gradual increases in life expectancy as you get to higher levels of income. Right? So the more we earn, the longer we live, right? But there are diminishing returns to that. So you get this curve. The interesting thing is that if you draw that curve in, say, 1950, and then you go back today and do the same analysis, income and life expectancy, you get the same curve, but it's shifted higher. So that now, today, at every level of income, we're living longer than we did 50 years ago. Now, why is that? At the most fundamental level, it's simply because we live in a richer information environment today than we did 50 years ago. Right? We have, new and better medicines. Right? But what is a medicine but a tool? It's a piece of information that I've put into an object that we can all benefit from, even if we don't understand it. Right? So as our information environment gets richer, history says we're all better off. Okay. And having said all that, I think I did have a anyway. No. Sorry, I had the curve. I'm sorry. So this is the curve I'm talking about, right? 50 years later. What's changed? The curve has shifted upwards. I thought I had a curve. I'm sorry. I'm a little under the weather. You're going to have to forgive me. Right. So, which leads me to, maybe I want to make a few provocative statements. One thing I think that is certainly true is that, and we've been spending 2 weeks talking about climate change. I'm going to challenge that a bit. In the big picture, now is the best time in history to be alive. And I'm pretty sure that's true. You take things like wealth, right? So since 1990, extreme poverty, as the World Bank measures it, has fallen from about 2 billion to, these are 2012 numbers, they've now got 2014 numbers out, to about 700 million people. So there are 1.3 billion people fewer living in extreme poverty today than in 1990. And this is the first time in recorded history that we've managed to shrink, if you will, the base of the base of the economic pyramid, even as the overall pyramid gets bigger. Right? It's the first time in history that we've managed to shrink the ranks of the extremely poor while increasing our global ranks. Since 1990, we've added 2.5 billion people to the population. But there are 1.3 billion fewer poor people in the world. Education is another very positive aggregate story of the last 25 years. So in 1990, what percentage of adults could not read or write in the world? Any guess? It was half. 50% of adults could not read or write in 1990. Now it's 12%. Right? So we've actually added 3 billion literate people to the population since 1990. Schooling, and this is a global story. If you break it down by country, it generally holds true, with a few tragic exceptions, in every country of the world. Right? Literacy, schooling is going up. Higher education. Right? So, thanks in large part to the rapid expansion of university education outside of North America and Western Europe, there are more people alive today with a higher education degree than all degrees awarded in history prior to 1980. So we're an extremely wealthy and educated cohort. in global terms. We're living longer than we've ever lived before. Humanity has happily experienced two 20-year lifts in life expectancy. So from 30 to 50, from 50 to 70. Right? It took us about 200 years to lift average life expectancy from 30 to 50 years. It's only taken us just over 50 years to go from 50 to 70. Fertility is falling. I'm going to skip some of this stuff. Talking about the global, the context of climate change. One very important aspect of the world we live in today, of the challenges we face in the future, is demographic. What's happening to the world population. So we're all living longer than we ever have in history. Wherever we're born, we can expect to live longer than any previous generation in our country. What does that tell us? And fertility is falling. Right? Fertility is falling in every part of the world. So what do we know about human demography in the 21st century? We know that we're aging rapidly. Here, this is about us today. Average global age is just about 30 years old. Latin America is about the world average. Look at Latin America by 2090, where the average age is going to be almost 50 years old. Right? Talk about Asia again. By 2100, half of the world's seniors are going to be living in Asia. By 2100, the world population is going to be somewhere between 9 and 13.5 billion people. Now, demography, in some ways, is our best science of the future. And so when we're kind of gaming out what are the challenges we face, looking at our demography is actually a pretty good place to start, because we have some pretty good ideas of what our population is going to look like. And yet, even our best science of the future is unreliable. Right? So this difference between 9 billion and 13.5 billion, the low and the high case of what we expect the human population to be, is equal to the entire population of the world in 1975. So there is a whole 1975 humanity of uncertainty about a basic question like how many of us are there going to be in 80 years? Which should be surprising. I mean, we've got very good data about how many of us are alive today, because governments like to tax their citizens. We can't tax us unless we count them. And we have a very good understanding of how 2 people produce 3, right? And yet we have such wide uncertainty about the human population in the future. And the big reason for that is household decisions are very hard to model. Right? How many children will a household choose to have depends, it turns out, very heavily upon the socioeconomic environment. Right? Which is why when you go back a few slides to, Africa is where there's this biggest region of uncertainty of how fast is fertility going to fall. Right? And it varies quite widely among African countries, I should say. Right? But it's because of the uncertainty about what decisions our households going to make. Right? How safe and secure an environment are they going to be raising families in? Another enormous change that we're going through, that we've already gone through over the past 25 years, to the human condition, and I'm sure you've talked a lot about this the last couple of weeks, is urbanization. So, since the 1950s, the human population has doubled. Our urban population has quadrupled. There are 4 times as many people living in cities today as in our grandparents' time. And why is that? Because we have choice. And the more choices we have, the more of us choose to go to cities. Because we expect there's going to be better health care, better education, better entertainment, work, lifestyle choices, all of those things we expect to find in cities. The simplest way to see this urban expansion is just to look at megacities. In the 50s, there were only 2 cities on Earth with more than 10 million people, New York and Tokyo. Today, it's more like 40, and it's going to be about 50 by 2030. What this has meant is that we're all living much closer together. Half of humanity lives within 1 hour of a major city now. It's about 30% in what some might crudely call the developing world, and about 80% in the developed world, but the global average is half. So you can do this neat thought experiment. If we had a big drum here with 7.3 billion names in it, and we all picked a name out of that drum and walked out this door, then half of us would be able to shake hands with that person by this time tomorrow morning. Right? It's pretty extraordinary. 90% of all humanity now lives on just 10% of the land. Right? This has obviously enormous economic implications. It also has all sorts of implications for the kind of risks that we are exposed to now because of our proximity. I'll talk a bit more about the present. So that's the condition that we're living in. The economics, the demographics. Right? My proposition is that not only is now the best time in history to be alive, at least in raw aggregate terms, it's also the best time in history for science and discovery because of our proximity, because of our connections, because of this inflation in information power. And I'll give you just a couple sexy examples from the Oxford Martin School. So this is my institutional home. I thank them for the desk space. Free coffee, too. Oh, my God. Anybody have free coffee in their department? Oh, my God. There's a whole, as an aside, there is this whole weird study that somebody needs to do about what decisions departments make about coffee. When I first arrived at Oxford, there was a machine, and you had to have a token to get the coffee. And so we created this underground economy for tokens, right? Because anyway, I digress. So, how is science changing the human condition in our lifetimes? I'll give a couple examples. Nanotechnology, nanobiology. So there's a research group at the Oxford Martin School, and their basic idea is, why would we do chemotherapy with all of its terrible consequences to fight cancer when we could just take a cancer prevention pill, which would send little nano warriors into our bloodstream to find and kill the cancerous cells before they become tumors. Right? It would have huge implications for global life expectancy and the war on cancer. And it doesn't look like that yet. The artist's rendition. It looks like this. Okay? So, protein folding, very clever little basket into which we put a couple molecules of chemo drug. And then the lock of this basket, and I'm not a biologist, so maybe whoever can explain this better than I can. Lock in this basket is sensitive to the surfaces of cancerous cells. So it's just floating around in the bloodstream, but whenever it bumps against a cancer cell, it springs open and delivers just a couple molecules of cancer drug right where it's needed. Synthetic biology. We don't talk nearly enough about this yet. When Copernicus had his theory that the sun was the center of the universe, a lot of people were angry with him. Right? They say, "Who are you, Copernicus, right, to tell us that the Bible is wrong? God put the earth at the center of creation." And they were challenging him because he was trying to put into human hands powers that had only ever belonged to God. And when you look at synthetic biology, we're doing the same thing in the sense that we're putting into our hands powers that have always been beyond human control. Right? The ability to manipulate at a genetic level what the organism is, what the life is. And, we can already do strange things in the lab. I don't know, there are, I guess, several biologists here in the room, so I won't talk too much about this and look like an idiot. But, whoa, what's going on there? Okay, batteries. So 5 years ago now, the Chinese research team that took the genes from jellyfish that allow them to glow, put them into pig embryo, give birth to pigs that glow in the dark, right? A bit strange, but prove the point, right? That to some extent, we can look at organisms as a collection of programs, right? And we can take one program out of that organism, put it into another organism, and it can run that program too. Right? So we start to have this whole different perspective on what life is. Right? It's a collection of little pieces of code that we can run together, maybe. Right? And a lot of research now is understanding what are the limits of that idea. Right? How aggressive can we get at putting pieces of life together to make new life? One example, 2 years ago, scientists at Stanford took a yeast organism and modified it with a bit of California wildflower, a species of rat, a couple bacteria, and turned the yeast from an animal that turned sugar into alcohol into an animal that turned sugar into painkiller medication. Right? So pharmaceutical factories. Artificial intelligence. Right? This is a big area of research and not just technological, but social, economic disruption in our lifetime. Anyone here working on AI? Oh, you are. Let's talk about it afterwards. I have many questions. Right? Last year, the head of Google's AI lab, what's his name? I can't remember, Blasio, came to the Martin School and showed us some of the algorithms that they're playing with in their labs. Totally blew us away. He said, so we've been building this algorithm at Google that can take any picture and tell you where the picture was taken. Right? And it doesn't do it by looking at, sort of the GPS data from the phone. It looks at the picture itself. It recognizes the shapes and the colors and the shadows. So, that's not so impressive if this is the picture. Right? Obviously, this is downtown Sao Paulo. It could be Las Vegas, actually. So well, we know where this picture's taken too. Right? But what about this picture? Where was this picture taken? See, it used to be, and this is like 5 years ago, we told one another that pattern recognition is one of those things that the human brain does quite easily, but machines they just can't do that stuff yet. Right? But we're already at a place today where, we can build the algorithm to give computers superhuman pattern recognition capabilities. See, for us, I see sand and water, and so I say beach. Right? I know this is a beach. But which beach is it? Right? Human pattern recognition, I can't discern details that far. Right? But Google's AI engine says with 85% certainty, oh yeah, the Gulf Coast of Florida. Got to be. Right? And it's right. And we don't know exactly how it knows that. Right? This is why machine learning, we just train it to learn. And then eventually it can do things that we never trained it to do. Right? And so the excitement in so much AI application these days is, wow, well, where else could we use that? It turns out in a lot of other places. Right? And on and on and on and on. Sorry. I love to talk with my hands. As so on the topic here, we're talking about climate change, and one of the terrible challenges is outside this door, there's a society that hears all these amazing stories, right? And they think technology is going to save us. There's a coming technological utopia. So you can all go home. Just do what you do. Don't worry. Don't worry. Right? There's this exogenous thing called technology that's just going to invent these solutions to solve our problems for us. Right? And where did that idea come from? I blame this man, Thomas Edison. Right? And what was Thomas Edison's most important invention? Anyone? Some say the light bulb. I say it was the method of invention. Right? Because before Thomas Edison, at least this is admittedly more of an American story, but before Thomas Edison in the U.S., most invention was something like this. Right? It's like the mad scientist in his garage playing with things. And Thomas Edison, he was the guy who famously professionalized invention at a facility called Menlo Park. And Menlo Park sort of had, more this mentality. It's like, okay, there's a method to the madness here. We do basic research, we find the promising applications, commercialize them, we market them, we sell them, we fund some of the money back into basic research, and again and again and again, in a circle. Right? And it proved astoundingly successful. Right? And we began to expect sort of cheaper, faster, better user interface year after year after year. Right? And we've been trained to expect that, well, I'm on the iPhone 6, right? So it still has issues. But if anyone here has an iPhone 7, you have no more issues with your cell phone, I'm sure. Right? We've been trained to expect that technology is going to solve one problem after another, until eventually there's just no more problems left to solve. Right? And we live in this utopia. Now, we all here know that that's not how technology works. Right? That's not the role technology plays in society. It's never played that role. Right? But we got to explain that to the rest of the world. Right? That technology never solves our problems. It just replaces one set of problems with another set of problems. And that's always been true. So, take climate change, for example. So fossil fuels, we discovered abundant oil under the ground, and hey, this is useful stuff. Fossil fuels solve an enormous problem. How do we fuel civilization? Where does the energy for civilization come from? Right. So we solved a big problem. But we also introduced another, right? Which is, carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. Right? But, technologists and scientists say, no problem. We can solve that, right? We'll call it renewables. Right? So we eliminate the carbon problem. But in doing so, we all know, we've reintroduced two other problems that the fossil fuels solved really well. Right? One is, how do we store energy? Right? Which for fossil fuels is in the chemical bonds, and in renewables has to be some form of battery. A whole other slew of problems. And then, how do we concentrate energy to do explosive work? I spent a lot of time with senior execs at Rolls-Royce, the engine makers in the UK. And every time we meet, they're talking about, power density in the batteries, but there's still a long way to go to be able to concentrate electrical energy to do explosive work. Right? And this, by the way, this problem today exists in every domain of technology. Right? So medicine, right? Next time you go to the doctor, say thank you. Right? So modern medicine, right now, is increasing our life expectancy so fast that for every 24 hours we spend, we get 4 to 5 hours back in improved life expectancy. 4 to 5 hours a day. That's how fast our life expectancy is growing. It's astonishing, right? It solves a big problem, which is death. Right? But it also introduces another problem, which is we've discovered that the science of extending the healthy life of the body is far easier than the science of extending the healthy life of our minds. And so more and more of us are going to live long enough to experience mental degeneration, right? Which is a huge medical problem, public policy problem, health system problem, household problem, family problem. Right? Robotics, right? Automation, right? Are robots going to be our overlords? Are they going to take over? I hope so. Jobs. A lot of commentators now are talking about the future of work, right? Which was scary enough when the robots took away sort of jobs on the manufacturing assembly line. Right? But now the robots are moving into the service industry. Right? Yeah. So Amazon is starting this year. It's already open just for their own employees. And they're going to open it to the broader public. Grocery stores that have no human staff. Right? And so it's really quite cool. I've toured one of them. You swipe in just like going onto the subway with your phone. Take whatever you want off the shelf. Cameras and sensors automatically know what you've taken. And then you just walk out. And when you leave the store, it gets charged to your Amazon account. Right? There's one group at the Martin School looking at the impact of automation on jobs. And this is their number. They figure that in North America, Western Europe, 48% of all current jobs won't exist by 2050 because they'll be done by robots. And so, we've got this massive question about how are we going to deal with the problem that automation is creating, right? Which I guess leads me to sort of my concluding section comment that, yes, I think this is the best time in history to be alive. I think it's the best time in history to do science and discovery. But I think it may also be our most fragile moment. And, you've spent the last 2 weeks, talking about maybe the most important example of that fragility. It's broader than climate change, though. There are so many dimensions of risk that we are now exposed to. And it all has to do with, I guess, two underlying conditions that we live in today. One is concentration. And I think of concentration as a dilemma. So I talked about urbanization, right? When we all gather into cities, we increase the risk of fast-moving pandemics, like H1N1, for example, SARS, Ebola, right? And their ability to spread. But it's a real dilemma, because what am I going to do about that, right? The fact that we're all moving into cities is all of us having more choice, right? More resources to move to where we think there's a better future for us. We all individually make what seem to be good choices, and yet there is this aggregate consequence, right? I flew in a couple of days ago from the UK to come here and be with you here today in this room, right? And I firmly believe that was a good decision to make. I was so happy to be here. It's wonderful to be in this room with you, spend time talking about something so important to all of us, right? But there's a dilemma that a lot of us are making good choices like that. And there is this aggregate consequence that none of us intended, right? And the other condition is complexity, right? That in so many of our systems, our infrastructure, our environment, financial systems, right? Their complexity is rising faster than our understanding. And so there's this big blind spot opening up, right? That's making it hard for us to make good decisions even though we want to. And I think of the complexity condition as kind of like a demon, right? It's hard to see, it's hard to understand. For some people, it's even hard to believe that it's there, right? But then we have all this evidence that it's there, like climate change, like pandemics. So this is a rather scary slide that the pandemics research group at my research unit put together. So if a highly infectious airborne virus enters any airport in the world, this is what it looks like 3 days later. And you pick any starting point, run the scenario, 3 days later, same picture. Right? Now, not to scale. We have protocols in place, right? So governments are starting to get good at this. Our tax dollars are well spent in many cases. If some highly infectious strain, some human strain of H5N1, for example, is reported, that day, none of us are going anywhere. This is all going to be shut down because of this reality. Right? Solar flares. Anyone do research on the sun? The sun, we rely upon it for life. It also has a mind of its own. Every now and then it shoots big solar flares into space. That's bad for electrical systems. Right? The biggest solar flare to ever hit the Earth was about 1850, called the Carrington event. Fried the Victorian internet. which at that time meant early signaling systems along rail lines in America and Western Europe. In 2012, NASA recorded second largest solar flare. And it almost hit the Earth. It almost hit us. It missed us by just 2 weeks. So it was in the right place at the wrong time. Or, depending how you think of it, it's in the right place at the right time. So it tore directly through Earth's orbital path, but we had just passed by. And had that solar flare hit us, NASA scientists calculated it would have caused about $40 trillion in damage to planetary electrical systems. Now, admittedly, part of that number is probably NASA hoping for more research dollars to study this phenomenon, right? As academics, sometimes we do that. But, but the point is that, think of the last 50 years of development. All the changes that have taken place in the world, none of them have affected the possibility of that flare hitting us. Right? But everything we have done, all the concentrating of things we value onto our electrical networks, has increased the cost of that event if it does happen. Right? And so that's the new fragility that we live in. Cybersecurity. 10 years ago, no one talked about it. Now we all talk about it. Why? Because we've poured almost everything that we value onto digital networks. Right? And from a security point of view, it's really difficult to see the risks. Right? It's easy to commit cybercrime because you can be anonymous. And it's hard for a lot of people to take the threat seriously, right? Because it's so hard to see it coming. Right? Financial crisis, won't talk about that. Inequality now. Right? So we live in business, technology is changing at revolutionary speed, right? But governance and institutions evolve much slower, right? And so we're seeing inequality rising, especially in what Thomas Piketty called the Anglo-Saxon world, right? Because there's this lag in the outcomes that the economy is producing and what we politically have decided to do about sharing those outcomes. Right? So a good example, back in 1990, the big three car makers in Detroit, GM, Ford, Chrysler, right? Together they were worth about $25 billion. And they employed 1.25 million people. Okay. Today, the big three tech companies, right, Amazon, Google, Facebook, right, Apple, before, are together worth about $2 trillion. Right? And they employ altogether less than 250,000 people. Right? And one of the consequences is rising income inequality. Right? So fewer people input per dollar of value created. And this has all sorts of implications for the context in which we think about climate change. I mean, look at what's happened in the U.S. The last couple of years. How the politics has shifted to this urgent question about my job, my economic well-being, because our government systems aren't keeping up with how quickly outcomes are changing in the economy. The OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, did a big fat report in 2015 on income inequality across OECD countries. I summarized it in one slide. Basically, if all the income in the OECD was a pie, then one person eats half the pie. 5 people eat the other half. And 4 people eat the crumbs that are left over. So I'm not making any value judgment whether that's good or bad. I'm saying that it creates an unstable political environment that makes it very, very difficult to focus a broad public upon issues like climate change. And yeah. What time is it here? 10:30. And maybe I'll wrap up with that, which is just to say, so, there's all this stuff, right, that is happening in the world right now. There's this economic transition, away from North America and Western Europe. There's massive technological change happening. Everything from synthetic biology to nanotechnology to artificial intelligence, with real implications for all of us. There's this demographic shift from a young world to a rapidly aging world, right? And all amidst this technological revolution that has just completely transformed our basic intuitions for how we communicate and exchange ideas. And I think part of the challenge of navigating through this moment that we live in is to try to step back, right? To take a deep breath and find a perspective, right, that helps us to not feel overwhelmed, but to have a sense that maybe we've been here before. Maybe in the face of all of this, there is wisdom that we can draw from many places, I say from history, to help us to thrive through this moment. Because, the European Renaissance 500 years ago, it left a legacy in some ways terrible and in some ways beautiful that we still celebrate today. And, I think that we do live in a second Renaissance, another moment of new maps and new media, of flourishing genius and flourishing risk. And our challenge, our historic challenge, is to try not to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to try to repeat the positive legacy. And so I leave that to all of you. All right, thanks very much. I need some water. We'll take a break. How long are we going to break for?
30 minutes, a little bit less, 20 minutes.
Okay, so we'll come back shortly before 11. And thanks.